What happens when two cops think they can write their own rules until they cross the one man who actually writes them? They thought the system would protect them. They thought wrong, because when it turned against them, they never saw it coming. And what happened next? It left an entire city speechless. Shadow Ridge had its own rhythm, a steady, pulsing beat of grit and resilience, laced with just enough hardship to keep everyone sharp. The cracked sidewalks whispered stories of better days and harder times. Houses leaned in toward one another like old men, trading secrets no one else could bear to hear. And the air? It carried a weight, a mixture of weary hope and exhaustion. Shadow Ridge didn't beg for attention, but it demanded respect. People in Shadow Ridge knew how to mind their own business. They knew when to keep their heads down and when to stand tall. But trouble? It didn't need an invitation. Trouble knew where everyone lived, and sometimes it came knocking whether you were ready or not. 13-year-old Ellis Graves jogged toward the corner store, his worn-out sneakers slapping the pavement in time with the bass thumping from a passing car. In his hand, he clutched a few crumpled bills his father had handed him before heading to his second job. Enough for a cold drink and maybe a candy bar if he played it right. Nothing fancy, nothing special, just a quick run for a blue raspberry slushie. His reward for surviving another day at school, knocking out chores, and dodging the daily stress that came with being young, black, and stuck in a neighborhood where the rules weren't always written for you. As he reached the curb, Ellis caught sight of Miss Adele from down the street. She was a fixture in Shadow Ridge, as much a part of the neighborhood as the cracked fire hydrant on the corner or the faded mural across the old library wall. Right now, though, Miss Adele was struggling. 2 paper grocery bags sagged in her frail arms, trembling under their weight. Without hesitation, Ellis crossed the street. "Here, let me get that for you, ma'am," Ellis said, flashing a grin that could light up even the darkest corners of the block. Miss Adele let out a breath of relief, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses as she looked up at him. "You're a good boy, Ellis Graves. This world could use a few more like you." Ellis chuckled, shifting the heavy bags into his arms like they were nothing. "I'm just here for the free snacks," he teased. She laughed, shaking her head. "Lord, you're something else." By the time Ellis helped her up the front steps and into her kitchen, she was already rummaging through her coin purse. She pressed a worn dollar bill into his palm with a knowing smile. "Treat yourself, sugar." Ellis gave her a quick nod and jogged back toward the store, tucking the bill into his pocket. The promise of that ice-cold slushie pushed him forward, his mind already tasting the sugary rush. The sun was dipping low now, casting long golden streaks across the pavement. But Ellis wasn't paying attention to the sky. He was focused on the freezer section, already imagining the cup in his hand, condensation dripping down the side. The store smelled like old linoleum and even older candy, the kind of place that had been there forever. The cooler doors stuck if you pulled too hard, and the security cameras were there more for show than function. The buzzing neon lights overhead flickered as Ellis made his way down the narrow aisles. That's when the chill ran up his spine. 2 men stood at the counter. Officers Colton Briggs and Shane Mercer. Everyone in Shadow Ridge knew them, and not for good reasons. They weren't the type who protected and served. They were the kind that lingered, watching, smirking, waiting. The kind who smiled at you one second and had you in cuffs the next. You'd be lucky if that was all. They weren't in uniform that day, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. Briggs took a sip from his fountain drink, his pale blue eyes never leaving Ellis. Mercer leaned against the counter, arms crossed, that slow smirk spreading across his face like he already knew how this was going to play out. "Look at this one," Briggs muttered, tilting his cup in Ellis' direction. "But he's up to something." Rule number 1 in Shadow Ridge: don't give them a reason, even if they were looking for one. Ellis kept his head down, moved toward the register like he didn't hear a thing. Don't engage. Don't react. But Mercer wasn't about to let it slide. "Hey, kid," he called, too casual. "Forgot something?" Ellis stopped, heart pounding. He turned slowly, schooling his expression into one of blank curiosity. Briggs lifted a small, unmarked candy bar, twirling it between 2 fingers like a magician showing off a trick. "Free sample," he said, like it was some kind of inside joke Ellis wasn't in on. Limited edition. It fell off. Wrong in a way Ellis couldn't quite put his finger on. But free was free, right? He hesitated only a second before reaching for it. Big mistake. The moment Ellis stepped outside, he tore open the wrapper with all the excitement of a kid who thought he'd just scored something rare. The foil crinkled in his hands. The chocolate inside looked perfectly normal. Smooth. Dark. Nothing unusual. He popped a piece into his mouth. That's when he knew. The taste slammed into him like a punch. Bitter. Metallic. Like he'd licked a rusted pipe or sucked on a penny that had been sitting in an old jar. His stomach turned. Ellis spat the piece onto the sidewalk, wiping his tongue with the back of his hand. Something was wrong. Really wrong. The wrapper was plain. No logo. No label. Generic in the worst way. His gut told him to throw it away. To run. But he was 13. And sometimes, when you're 13, your gut doesn't always win. He shook it off. Told himself it was just some nasty health snack. Rich folks loved bitter chocolate, right? He'd barely eaten any. No harum. No fold. Pocketing the rest, Ellis focused on his slushie. By the time he finished it, he figured the weird taste would be long gone. But by the time he got home, his stomach had other plans. A dull ache curled deep inside him. Not from cold, slushy brain freeze. Something else. Something darker. His skin prickled, sweat breaking out along his hairline though the breeze had turned cool. His fingers twitched. His vision blurred. He stumbled up the steps of his house, gripping the railing like his life depended on it. "Dad," he whispered, the word paper thin. Inside, Chief Dorian Graves sat hunched over case files. He didn't look up right away. Work followed him home more than he liked. But when he finally glanced over and saw his son swaying in the doorway, he froze. Ellis. He was on his feet in a heartbeat, crossing the room in 2 long strides. His hands went to Ellis' face, checking for fever, his pulse. What he found made his stomach drop. "Tell me what's wrong," Dorian demanded, his voice steel-wrapped in silk. Ellis' lips parted. "Candy," he rasped. Dorian's chest went cold. They were in the car within seconds. Sirens wailed in his head as he tore through intersections, red lights meaningless. His boy, his only boy, was barely breathing. Every glance at Ellis in the passenger seat made him drive faster. "Stay with me," he muttered, over and over. And when Ellis whispered, "Briggs," Mercer, Dorian Graves nearly ran off the road. The ER doors burst open. Nurses swarmed. Ellis was rushed away. The doctor's words, "poisoning," hit Dorian like a hammer. He stood there for a long time after they vanished behind double doors. Silent. Rigid. Then his rage boiled over. The call to internal affairs was short. "Briggs." "Mercer," he growled. "Now." Detective Roxanne Vega was silent on the other end. Then she said, "Chief, you might want to sit down." "I'm standing." This isn't their first time. The words hung there like smoke. Dorian's world tilted. He wasn't dealing with 2 rogue cops. He was staring down an entire system that had let this happen. Over and over. But not anymore. When Chief Graves stormed into the precinct, the air shifted. Conversations died. Eyes lowered. Some cops stood taller. Others looked for exits. They all knew something was coming. He found Briggs and Mercer at their desks. Relaxed. Smug. Untouchable. Not for long. "My office," Dorian said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. They went. Slow. Mocking. Inside, Dorian shut the door with a slam that shook the walls. Then he spoke, low and lethal. "My son. Hospital. Because of you." Mercer chuckled. "You sure about that?" That smirk died fast when Dorian had him against the wall, hand gripping his throat. "You listen to me," Dorian growled. "If my son dies, I will end you." They thought they were safe. No cámaras. No witnesses. No proof. Wrong. Suspended. Pending investigation. But Dorian wasn't waiting. He was digging. And Vega found enough dirt to bury them both. Then came the sting operation. A fake suspect. A fake crime. Lisa Carter, the journalist who never backed down, leaked the right rumor. Briggs and Mercer took the bait. They planted evidence on a kid who didn't exist in the system. Dorian caught it all on tape. By the time Dorian walked into the captain's office with a flash drive, it was over. The captain watched the footage, face draining of color. "Fire them," Dorian said, "or I call the feds." An hour later, Briggs and Mercer were in cuffs. Ellis survived. Barely. But when Dorian sat by his bed and whispered, "They're done," Ellis smiled. The trial was public. Messy. Necessary. Shadow Ridge watched as the jury convicted Briggs and Mercer on every charge. But it didn't stop there. The entire department was swept clean. And Dorian Graves? He made sure it stayed that way. Ellis walked out of the hospital stronger than ever. Because in Shadow Ridge, they tried to break him. But all they did was make him unstoppable.